until very recently, the largest Chinese investment in Africa was in South Africa. And many people are surprised by this because it was actually a Chinese bank, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, that purchased 20% of Standard Bank in South Africa. So this was about $5 billion, and that was a very large sum in 2008 when the transaction happened. So it's larger than just about any mine that the Chinese have invested in or an oil investment. So that's an interesting example of how the Chinese are thinking for the future, because that investment in Standard Bank was in part to cooperate with Standard Bank, which had relationships with other countries in Africa and knew a lot more about how to do banking in those other countries. And so that relationship between ICBC, the Chinese bank, and Standard Bank has evolved over the last almost 15 years. And so they do joint finance of infrastructure projects together. And infrastructure is actually the largest economic sector of Chinese engagement in Africa. Chinese companies are earning revenues of $50 billion a year from infrastructure. And this is often, this is not well understood, I think, by people who are not familiar with these economic relationships. But infrastructure is a very large market. In Africa, actually, it makes up a third of Chinese construction firms that are operating overseas. A third of their business comes from infrastructure in Africa. So where are the countries where this infrastructure is happening? And where are the countries where China also has other kinds of large engagement? The other country that I think is particularly important for China in Africa is Angola. Angola is exceptional in the China-Africa context. Angola is by far the largest recipient of Chinese lending, and it's also the largest supplier in Africa of oil to China. And those two things go together. So there's a very interesting model where the Chinese supply a loan to Angola, and Angola repays that loan with oil. So that kind of relationship is not that unusual. However, what is unusual is that in this particular case, the Chinese banks tie those loans to infrastructure projects. And so what this means is that the Angolans they build roads and bridges and electricity projects and water projects, and they've done this all across. There are hundreds and hundreds of these projects in Angola, all built by Chinese companies, all financed by Chinese loans, all repaid with Angolan oil. And the reason I think it's an interesting model is that other kinds of commercial banks that operate in Angola, they also might have an oil secured loan, as we call these. But there's no restriction on how the Angolan government might use that oil. So it could be used for completely corrupt purposes. It could be sent back to Europe and go into a Swiss bank account. But the Chinese money actually goes into building infrastructure. And I think that's positive. There may be other kinds of issues with that. For example, kickbacks, corruption, these could add to the price. It could be that the quality is not as good as it would be if it was done certainly by an American company or a European company. But at the end of the day, Angola is getting a lot of infrastructure with that oil money. And we don't have a way to actually make that happen.